Owen Marsh walked into a bank in Staunton, Virginia, with a business plan for a 1,000-year farm. The loan officer read it, looked up, said, "Who benefits from this?" "You'll be dead in 30 years. Owen said, "Whoever is here in 300. The loan officer approved it anyway. His neighbors called it the 1,000-year joke. The engineer from Richmond, who planted trees he'd never eat from, who spaced his chestnuts for 80 years from now, who talked about soil the way other people talked about their children. Then the bank called, 12 months to show conventional revenue, or they were reconsidering the loan. Owen had no cattle, no grain, no hay bales anyone could count. Just young trees in frozen ground and a design that wouldn't fully reveal itself for half a century. And one question he couldn't answer yet. What do you show a bank when everything worth showing is invisible? Owen Marsh bought the land in February. Not because February was a good time to buy land in Western Virginia. It wasn't. The ground was frozen, and the fields were brown, and the creek running through the lower section was dark and low, and anyone who knew anything about land would tell you that you couldn't see what you were getting in February. You needed May or July or September after a heavy rain, when the drainage revealed itself, when the soil showed what it could actually do. Owen knew this. He bought it anyway. He was 43 years old. He had spent 18 years as a structural engineer in Richmond, designing buildings meant to last 100 years, maybe 200. He had been good at it. And he had found, somewhere around year 15, that designing things to last 200 years was not what most of his clients actually wanted. They wanted buildings that looked like they would last 200 years, built quickly, built cheaply, sold quickly. The gap between those two things had grown, over 15 years, into something he could no longer stand over. So he left, took the savings, told his wife Sarah what he wanted to do, which was to buy land and build something on it designed to last not 200 years but 1,000. Sarah had looked at him for a long moment and said, "What does that mean exactly?" He said, "I don't entirely know yet." She said, "Okay." That was the end of the discussion, which was one of the reasons he had married her. The land was 212 acres in Augusta County, Virginia. Rolling ground, mixed field, and second-growth timber. The creek in the lower section, and on the south-facing slope above the creek, the best soil Owen had ever put his hands into. Deep, dark, crumbling in the way of soil that has been building organic matter for a very long time without much disturbance. He crouched in that frozen February field and put both hands into it and felt something he had not felt about a piece of ground before. The ground had something to say. It was willing to say it to someone who would listen. He paid $740,000 for it, more than he had. He borrowed the difference from a bank in Staunton. The loan officer was a man named Dale Fenton, who wore a tie to work and had a photograph of his own small cattle farm on his office wall, and who read Owen's business plan with the expression of a man reading something in a language he partially understood. "A 1,000-year farm," Dale said. "That's the concept," Owen said. "What does that mean in terms of revenue projections?" "The revenue projections are not the point," Owen said. Dale looked at him over the plan. "A bank loan requires revenue projections, Mr. Marsh. The farm will generate income. Timber, perennial crops, cattle on the open ground. The income will service the debt." Owen paused. "But the design is not optimized for income. It's optimized for soil building, biodiversity, and long-term ecosystem function." "For 1,000 years," Dale said. "Yes." Dale looked at the plan for another moment, then at the photograph on his wall. Then he said, "I'm going to approve this loan, but the committee is going to have questions." "What kind?" "The kind that come from people who have never thought about 1,000 years, Dale said. He said it without irony. It was the most honest thing anyone said to Owen in the entire loan process. The farm had a name when Owen bought it. The previous owner, an elderly man named Russell Carver, who had run cattle on it for 40 years and whose children had no interest in farming, had called it Carver Hollow. Owen kept the name. He was not interested in renaming things. He was interested in understanding them. The first year was the year of looking. He had read everything he could find on long-rotation farming, agroforestry, food forests, soil ecology, perennial polyculture. Martin Crawford's work on food forests in Devon, Wes Jackson on perennial grain systems, David Holmgren on permaculture design, the ethnobotanical literature on Native American food forests in the eastern woodlands, the research on ancient forest garden systems in West Africa and South Asia, some maintained for millennia. He had read all of it and found it useful. And he had also found, when he put his hands in the South Slope soil, that reading about soil and knowing soil were different things. So the first year he walked the farm, every section, every week, in different seasons. He walked it in May when the second-growth timber was leafing out, and he could see which species were volunteering where and what that told him about the soil beneath. He walked it in July in the heat, and felt where moisture was holding and where it wasn't. He walked it in September after the rains and watched the drainage patterns. Which sections shed water, which held it, which sent it somewhere useful, and which sent it somewhere problematic. He walked it in November when the leaves were down and the land's structure was visible without the distraction of vegetation. He kept notebooks, detailed ones, the kind an engineer keeps, organized around questions rather than tasks. Sarah kept her job in Richmond that first year, driving out on weekends. She was a landscape architect. She brought a different eye to the land than Owen's, which was useful. She looked at it the way she looked at design problems, with the attention of someone trying to understand what the place wanted to become rather than what you wanted to make it. "The old hedgerows," she said one October afternoon. They were standing at the east boundary of the property, looking at a line of old Osage orange that Russell Carver had planted as a living fence 60 years ago. Thick-trunked now, gnarled, spaced every 20 feet, and the space between filled with volunteer black locust and elderberry and wild grape and a dozen other species that had found the hedgerow's edge and made a home there. "What about them?" Owen said. "They've been doing your job for 60 years, she said. "They didn't know that, but look at what they built." She pointed to the soil beneath the hedgerow, visibly darker than the field soil on either side, more crumbled, richer, 60 years of leaf litter, 60 years of root action, 60 years of habitat. Nobody planned it. It just happened because the conditions were right. "What are you saying?" "Your plan is good," she said. "And the land already has its own plan. You should spend at least as much time understanding its plan as promoting yours." He had been married to Sarah for 16 years, and she had said things like this the whole time. He was getting better, incrementally, at listening. He went back to the hedgerow the next morning and spent 3 hours doing nothing but looking at it. The neighbors began forming opinions in the spring of the second year. Augusta County was agricultural country, had been for 300 years, cattle and hay operations mostly, some row crops, a few orchards in the limestone belt to the east. The farming culture was conservative in the way that agricultural cultures are conservative when they have been doing things the same way for a long time and have good reasons for most of those things. They were skeptical of people who arrived with different ideas. Owen was not the first. There had been back-to-the-land people in the 70s, organic farmers in the 80s and 90s, hobby farmers from cities who bought land, planted things, ran out of money or patience or both, and went back to wherever they came from. Owen looked like the next version. The engineer turned farmer from Richmond, who would spend a few years doing something unusual and then leave. This was not an uncharitable reading of the evidence. He had bought land in February, had not planted anything in his first year except cover crops, was talking about trees that would not produce food for 50 years, had a design plan longer than any agricultural document most people in Augusta County had ever seen, and the length of it was itself suspicious. There was a farm supply store in Swoop called Hensley's, second generation. Been there since 1961. The social center of the agricultural community in the way that places where farmers spent money and time became social centers. Owen went to Hensley's regularly because he needed things, and because going where people gathered was how you learned where you were. On a morning in April of the second year, Owen came in for fencing supplies. 3 neighboring farmers were at the counter. The conversation paused when he came in. Resumed after a moment in a slightly different register. He had been in enough situations to recognize the pause. He bought what he needed and was walking out when one of the men, a large farmer named Boyd Skelton, who ran 400 acres of cattle to the north, said to the store owner, in a voice that was not quite a stage whisper, "1,000-year farm." The other 2 men made sounds that were not quite laughter. Owen did not turn around. He loaded the fencing in his truck and drove back to the farm. He sat in the truck for a few minutes in the driveway, looking at the south slope through the windshield. He called Sarah that evening. Boyd Skelton made a joke of it at Hensley's today, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Is he wrong about the timeline? No. Is he wrong about what you're doing? No. Then the problem isn't what Boyd Skelton thinks, she said. The problem is that you haven't shown him anything yet. You've been here 2 years and the visible output is cover crops and young trees that look like weeds. She paused. You're asking people to trust a design they can't see. That's a hard ask in any field. In farming, it's almost impossible. He sat with that after he hung up. She was right. He had been framing the 1,000-year horizon as a philosophical position and expecting people to respect it as philosophy. But Augusta County did not run on philosophy. It ran on outcomes, on hay baled and cattle sold and fields that looked productive. He had not yet produced anything that looked productive by the county's standard. What bothered him was not Boyd's mockery. Exactly. It was the thing being mocked, not his competence or his methods, the time frame itself. The idea that caring about what happened to land in 1,000 years was the absurdity. That designing something with that horizon in mind was what was strange. He thought about what the man who planted the Osage orange hedgerow had been thinking 60 years ago. Probably not about 1,000 years. Probably about a fence that would last longer than barbed wire and feed wildlife, and maybe give his kids something to look at. A modest thought, a practical thought, and 60 years later it was teaching Owen Marsh things about soil ecology that he had not gotten from any book. He went to plant trees the next morning. The planting plan he had developed over the first year was based on an engineering principle applied to ecology. In structural engineering, you design from function rather than form, built around what the structure needed to do, then let the appearance emerge. In ecology, it meant designing from what the land needed to become, and letting the harvests emerge from the ecosystem. The south-facing slope above the creek was the heart of it. Canopy trees planted 40 feet apart, chestnuts, hickories, persimmons, understory trees filling in beneath, serviceberries, pawpaws, crabapples, shrub layer along the edges, hazelnuts, elderberries, gooseberries, currants. Ground layer in the spaces between, comfrey, yarrow, wild strawberry, clover. Vines on the canopy trees, hardy kiwi, native grapes. The chestnuts were the anchors. They would not produce meaningful food for 40 years. They would reach full production in 50, and if the historical record of chestnut forest productivity held, they would produce for centuries after that. He planted by hand, him and Sarah on weekends, and increasingly a young man named Theo Jackson, who had come to the farm looking for work in March of the second year and stayed. Theo was 24, from Waynesboro, no agricultural background. But he had a quality Owen had recognized in the first week: physical attentiveness. He noticed things. He asked questions that showed he was thinking, not just following instructions. Why this spacing? Theo asked one morning in May, watching Owen measure between chestnut plantings. It's the spacing that makes sense in 80 years, Owen said. When these trees are full grown, they'll need this space. Right now, it looks too wide. Theo looked at the spacing, at the young trees, barely knee height. You won't be alive in 80 years, he said. It wasn't mockery. It was observation. That's the point, Owen said. Theo thought about this. So you're doing all this for people you'll never meet? Yes. Why? Owen thought about how to answer. He had been thinking about it for 2 years and had a version of the answer, but it changed every time he tried to put it in words, which meant he didn't fully have it yet. Because someone did it for me, he said, the Osage-orange hedgerow on the east boundary. Someone planted it 60 years ago and never ate anything from it, and I'm learning from the ecosystem it built. He planted another chestnut. That person didn't know me. Probably didn't think about me. They just did something good for the land, and the land did the rest. I'm trying to do the same thing. Theo was quiet. Then, does it bother you that nobody around here gets that? Yes, Owen said, less than it used to. The crisis came in the 3rd year. It arrived as a phone call from Dale Fenton on a Tuesday morning in October. In the tone of voice that precedes bad news that has been thought about carefully before delivery. Dale said the bank had completed its annual review. Owen's loan was flagged as high risk, lack of conventional income metrics. The bank was not calling the loan. He wanted to be clear about that. But if the situation did not show improvement in the next review cycle, 12 months now out, the committee would have to consider its options. Owen asked what improvement would look like. Revenue, Dale said. Conventional agricultural revenue, cattle, hay, grain, orchard. Something the committee could understand. Owen went out to the south slope that afternoon. The chestnuts were knee height. The pawpaws were shoulder height. The hazelnuts had put on 2 feet of growth. The elderberries were already producing small, dark clusters that he had been selling at the Staunton Farmers Market for $8 a jar. But the slope looked like a field with small trees in it. To someone who didn't know what it was going to become, it looked like a beginning. To someone who knew, it looked like the beginning of something very large moving very slowly. He called Sarah that evening. She drove out the following Saturday, and they sat at the kitchen table with the financial records and the design plans and the bank's concerns, and worked through it the way they worked through problems, methodically, without pretending they knew the answer before they did. They went back and forth for 3 hours. Revenue ideas that compromised the design elements that could be accelerated, ways to make the farm's value visible to a loan committee without betraying what the farm was trying to be. At 11 o'clock, Sarah put down her pen and looked at the design plans. The workshop idea, she said. Owen had mentioned it once, months ago, not seriously, running workshops on food forest design and long rotation land management. There was interest, he thought, from farmers and landowners curious about these approaches. He had not pursued it because it felt like a distraction. People pay real money to learn this, Sarah said. Salatin at Polyface charges several $100s per person for farm tours and workshops, your design knowledge plus the farm as a living example. She looked at him. It's not a distraction. It's the knowledge transfer piece. It's what the farm is supposed to be for anyway. He was quiet. Boyd Skelton will call it a petting zoo, he said. Boyd Skelton's opinion is not a factor in our loan repayment, Sarah said. This was correct. He stared at the plans for another moment. Outside the window, the south slope was dark. He thought about what was in the ground out there, the chestnuts, the pawpaws, the years of soil building happening below visibility, below anyone's ability to see it or measure it or loan against it. Okay, he said. Workshops. He started building the program in November. The first workshop ran in April with 8 people. Farmers and homesteaders and 2 landscape architects from Charlottesville who had heard about it through Sarah. Owen walked them through the design principles and the planting logic. He explained the chestnut spacing. He showed them the elderberries producing in year 2 and the chestnuts that would produce in 50 and everything in between. A woman named Ruth, farming 10 acres in Rockbridge County, asked him something he had not been asked before. How do you make decisions about things you'll never see the outcome of? She said. He started to answer. Stopped, started again. I design from the end backward, he said. I decide what I want this land to be in 100 years. Then figure out what it needs to be in 50 to become that. Then what it needs to be in 20. Then what I need to do now to set it on that path. He paused. It's an engineering approach. You design from the destination, not the starting point. Ruth was quiet. That requires trusting that you understand what the land will need in 100 years. How do you know you're right? I don't, Owen said. I'm making the best decision I can with the information I have. Same as any decision. The difference is the time frame makes the uncertainty more visible. Most farmers I know don't think past the next season, Ruth said, without judgment, just as observation. Most farmers are trying to survive the next season, Owen said. I understand that. I'm in a position where I don't have to. I'm trying to use that to think about what nobody else has time to think about. That was the truest thing he had said about the farm since he bought it. The second workshop was 12 people. The third was 22. By the end of the first workshop year, he had run 7 sessions and turned away more than he accepted. The income was real, the bank was satisfied, and something else was happening. The farm was becoming known in Augusta County in a different way. Boyd Skelton came to the farm in September of the 4th year. He came alone, no warning call. He found Owen in the south slope planting chestnuts in the gaps the design called for. He parked and walked out and stood at the edge of the planting area. Owen saw him and kept working. Boyd stood for a few minutes without speaking. That was fine. Owen had learned in 4 years in Augusta County that waiting for people to say what they came to say was more productive than asking. My father planted walnut trees the year I was born, Boyd said finally. Said he was planting them for my grandchildren. He was quiet. I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was just something old farmers said. Owen kept working. Those trees are mature now, Boyd said. Worth about $40,000 if I sold the timber. Which I won't. He paused. I understand now that he wasn't being dramatic. Owen stood up. He looked at Boyd. I owe you an apology, Boyd said. For what I said at Hensley's. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Boyd looked at the young chestnuts. My father would have understood what you're doing. I should have understood it sooner. Owen nodded. He didn't say it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and they both knew it. How old are the walnuts? He said. 53 years, Boyd said. Same age as me. They stood looking at the chestnuts for a while. These will be here when my grandchildren are your age, Owen said. Boyd looked at the trees for a long moment. Then he said, I've got 80 acres on the north end of my property I've been trying to figure out what to do with. Soil's too thin for reliable hay, too steep for row crops. He looked at Owen. I'd like to talk to you about it. Owen said he was available Friday morning. Boyd came Friday, and they walked the 80 acres, and Owen asked questions for 2 hours before he said anything resembling a recommendation. Halfway through the walk, Boyd said, "You look at land the way my father looked at land, like it's talking and you're trying to hear it." "It is talking," Owen said. "Most people don't take the time to listen." "Why not?" "Because listening takes longer than deciding," Owen said. "And most people have been rewarded for deciding quickly their whole lives." Boyd was quiet. "My father was slow to decide. Drove me crazy when I was young. I understood later that it wasn't slowness. It was something else." He looked at the thin, soiled slope. "What do you call it?" "Attention," Owen said. Boyd nodded. "That's the word," he said. In the spring of the 5th year, Sarah walked the south slope with Owen on a Saturday morning and showed him something he had missed. She stopped in the northwest section of the planting where the ground had a slight concavity, a barely perceptible bowl shape that Owen had noted in his first-year observations, and then set aside as minor. She crouched down. "Look at the growth difference," she said. He crouched beside her. The chestnuts in the bowl-shaped area were noticeably more vigorous than those on either side. Not dramatically, but clearly once you saw it. The trees in the slight depression were 6 inches taller and the canopy slightly fuller. "The concavity is collecting cold air at night," she said. "But it's also collecting moisture. This section is running slightly wetter than the surrounding ground." She looked at the trees. "Your spacing assumption was based on uniform growing conditions across the slope. This section is going to reach canopy faster than you planned." Owen looked at the bowl and at the trees and at his planting maps. "The understory species I planted here might be outcompeted earlier than projected," he said. "Yes," she said, "maybe 5 to 7 years earlier." She stood up. "You should be tracking the microclimate variations systematically, not just walking it and noting, measuring temperature, moisture, aspect, section by section." "I need weather stations," he said. "You need weather stations," she did. He set up 4 weather stations the following month. The data they began generating changed several of the understory planting decisions for year 6, based on the microclimate differentiation Sarah had identified. Those changes would matter in 15 years. He did not say to her, "How did you see that when I missed it?" He knew how she had seen it. She had been looking at the slope with fresh eyes, not eyes already organized by prior observation into patterns that made certain things invisible. She had come to the slope not to confirm what she knew, but to see what was there. That was what attention actually meant. Not sustained observation of what you expected. Sustained openness to what you didn't. In the fall of year 5, the farm's soil data changed everything. Owen had been taking soil samples from 12 fixed points on the south slope every October since the farm purchase. Year 1 organic matter, average 2-3%. Year 5 organic matter, average 3-1%, a 35% increase in 5 years. The county extension literature said this rate of improvement was not possible without significant organic amendments. He had not applied organic amendments. He had planted things and let them grow, and let the biology do what biology does when you stop overriding it. Patrick Chen, the young county extension agent, who had come to the farm in the spring with skepticism and stayed 4 hours and gone back, and written a report his supervisor described as ambitious in its framing, came back in October when Owen showed him the data. Patrick looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. "How are you explaining this?" he said. "Minimal disturbances, biological diversity, time," Owen said. "The standard mechanisms. I'm just not overriding them." "Most farmers override them because they need yield this season," Patrick said. "Yes," Owen said. "I know." Patrick looked at the data again. "This is publishable." I know, Owen said. That's not why I did it. Why did you do it? Owen looked at the slope, at the young trees in the October light, at what was and what it was going to become. Because someone needed to find out what happens if you use the right time frame, he said. Most agriculture operates on the wrong time frame for what soil biology actually requires. Somebody needed to find out what happens if you use the right one. He paused. And because this land asked me to. I know that sounds strange. Does the land ask things of you often? Patrick said. When I'm listening, Owen said. Patrick published the soil data the following spring as an extension note. Short, practical, written for farmers. It circulated through Augusta County and through the Virginia Agricultural Extension Network, and then through National Sustainable Agriculture Networks. Over the following year, a steady stream of people came to the farm who wanted to talk to Owen about what he was doing. Most of them came from outside Augusta County. Inside Augusta County, the change was slower and less visible and more real. Boyd Skelton brought 3 neighbors to see his 80 acres in the fall. 2 of them left with questions they had not arrived with. A woman farming near Middlebrook called Owen and asked to walk the south slope and spent 2 hours asking good questions and started a small food forest the following spring. Kurt Hensley at Hensley's added a small section to the store display stocking native species and perennial plants that Owen commonly specified in design work. He did it without saying anything to Owen about it. Owen noticed it on an April visit and said nothing either. That was how things worked in Augusta County. Not with announcement, with action. In the 5th year, Owen learned something important about the American chestnut trees he was planting. He had known the basic history, the blight of the early 20th century. 4 billion trees lost, the species functionally extinct from the eastern forest by the 1950s. He had chosen the blight-resistant hybrid because it was the right canopy species for his design, not because of the restoration dimension. The trees he was planting were the result of decades of breeding work by the American Chestnut Foundation, 15/16 American chestnut, with demonstrated resistance to the fungal pathogen that had wiped out the species. What he had not fully understood until he talked to the Foundation's researcher, who came to the farm in June, was what the disappearance of 4 billion chestnut trees had done to the eastern hardwood forest. It had changed everything downstream. Mast production collapsed. Wildlife populations shifted. The forest species composition altered in ways that were still working themselves out 70 years later. He was not just planting trees. He was participating in the restoration of a species and an ecosystem that had been absent for 70 years. That was a different thing from what he had thought he was doing. Not a bigger thing, necessarily, just a different one. The 1,000-year horizon he had brought to the farm now had a specific biological meaning he had not fully grasped before. The time frame required to reintegrate a lost species into an ecosystem that had organized itself around that species' absence. That took more than 100 years, possibly more than 200. He stood in the south slope that evening and looked at the knee-high chestnuts and thought about the forest that had been here before the blight, and the forest that was going to be here after he was gone, and the connection between those two things that ran through these specific trees in this specific soil, in this specific hollow in Augusta County. The 1,000 years was not an arbitrary number. It was a biological time frame. It was how long it took for an ecosystem to do what it was trying to do. He had not fully understood that when he chose it. He understood it now. The 6th year was the year Owen changed how he talked, not what he was doing, not the design, how he described it. He had been leading with the 1,000-year frame and expecting people to engage with it as a concept. He had been explaining the ecological theory and the soil biology and the design principles. He had been showing data. All of it was true. None of it was how people actually changed their minds about things. People changed their minds about things the way Boyd Skelton had. Through a story. A walnut tree planted the year he was born, a number $40,000 attached to the decision. A connection between a man he had loved and a choice he could now understand. He had been starting with what he could measure. He should have been starting with what people could feel. He stopped leading with the 1,000-year frame. He started leading with the question of what kind of land you wanted to leave the person who came after you. He started talking about soil organic matter, not as a metric, but as a form of inheritance. He started describing the chestnut planting not as a long rotation investment, but as a letter to his grandchildren, written in trees. The conversations changed quality. He went to the Farm Bureau meeting in January of the 6th year, which Boyd had invited him to. He spoke for 20 minutes, questions afterward, mostly technical, good questions from people taking it seriously. But at the end, a man in the back whose name Owen did not know, large-framed, 60s, the look of someone who had farmed this county his whole life, said, "Who does this benefit? The 1,000-year thing. You'll be dead in 30 years. Who actually benefits from what you're doing?" It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one. Owen thought about it. "Whoever is here in 50 years, he said, and whoever is here in 200 years, and whoever is here in 500. He paused. "I know that's abstract, but somebody planted the forests we cut for timber in the last century. Somebody is always making decisions that shape what land can do for people they'll never know. I'm trying to make those decisions more consciously." The man was quiet. "That's not farming," he said. "That's something else." "What is it?" Owen said. "I don't know," the man said. "But it's something else." Owen drove home thinking about that. He was right. It was something else. And the something else was what made people in Augusta County uncomfortable in a way that was distinct from ordinary skepticism about methods. The methods could be evaluated. The data could be weighed, but the time frame could not be evaluated the usual way. Evaluating it required caring about a future that none of the people in that room would be alive to see. Most human systems, financial markets, political cycles, loan review periods, next season's yield, rewarded the short term. The capacity to care about outcomes beyond your own lifetime was real. It was not reinforced by any of those systems. It atrophied in most people the way any capacity atrophies when it is not used. Owen had been using it daily for 6 years. It had gotten stronger. In the 7th year, Theo Jackson surprised him. Theo came to Owen in March and said he wanted to develop the North Creek section as a nursery for the species Owen used in design work. The demand had exceeded what was available from existing nurseries in the region. Owen had been driving to Frederick, Maryland to source material for months. Theo had a business plan. 3 pages. Thorough in the way Theo had become thorough. The thoroughness of someone who had learned to think about second and third order effects before committing to a first order action. Owen read it. It was good. Better than the plan he had taken to Dale Fenton 7 years ago. That had been the plan of someone who understood the vision, but not yet the land. This was the plan of someone who understood both. "There's one thing missing," Owen said. Theo said, "What?" "Your name on the deed," Owen said. Theo was quiet. "You can't afford to give me land," he said. "I can afford to sell you the North Creek section at a fair price with favorable," Owen said. "Because the farm needs someone who will be here in 30 years when the chestnuts start producing, and in 50 years when they're in full production. I don't have children. Sarah and I have talked about this. The farm needs a different kind of succession." Theo looked out the window at the North Creek section. The black locusts from year 4 were 15 feet tall. The soil beneath them was dark and rich, and building towards something that would support a very different ecosystem in 10 years, and a different one again in 50. "I'm 29 years old," he said. "My grandfather was 24 when his grandfather handed him a piece of ground and said, 'Take care of this,'" Owen said. "He didn't feel ready either." "What did he do?" "He took care of it," Owen said, "for the rest of his life. And then he handed it to someone else." Theo thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he came back and said yes. They signed the deed on a Thursday morning in April, with Dale Fenton witnessing, at the same table in the same Staunton Bank office, where Owen had presented his business plan 7 years before. Dale looked at Theo the way he had looked at Owen in the beginning, with the expression of a man reading something in a language he partially understood. But he also looked at Owen, and in that look was something that had not been there in the beginning, which was the recognition that the plan Owen had brought him 7 years ago had produced this. A young man with his name on land, a farm that had been designed not to last the next season, but to last and to teach and to pass on. "The North Creek section," Dale said, looking at the deed. "What does that become in 50 years? A mature black locust and poplar system transitioning toward mixed hardwood," Theo said. "With productive understory in 15 years, significant timber value in 30, full ecological complexity in 50. He paused, and the nursery generating income from year 2. Dale looked at him for a moment. "You sound like him," he said, meaning Owen. "I learned from him," Theo said, "but also from the farm." He looked at Owen. "The farm teaches you things if you pay attention." Owen thought about the Osage orange hedgerow teaching Sarah, about Adeline's bean teaching Elias, about Boyd's father's walnut trees teaching Boyd, about all the lessons that had traveled not through institutions or programs or formal knowledge transfer, but through the daily practice of being present with a specific piece of ground over a long enough time. "It does," Owen said. They walked back to the farm after the signing. The April morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that meant the chestnuts were still a few weeks from leafing out. On the south slope, the trees stood bare-branched against the sky, their forms clear and structural, the design of the whole system visible in the architecture of the planting. Owen stopped at the edge of the slope and looked at it. This was the view he had seen in his mind before he bought the land. The system at year 7. The understory beginning to close in. The canopy trees establishing their dominance, the ground layer dense and working, the soil beneath it all improving every year, building the organic matter that would support everything above it for generations. The chestnuts were 9 feet tall. In 40 years they would be 50 feet tall and producing hundreds of pounds of nuts per tree. In 100 years they would be the canopy of a system that would bear almost no resemblance to the scrubby second-growth Owen had walked in February 7 years ago. In 300 years, if the trees survived, and the blight-resistant genetics said they should, they would be old growth. The kind of trees that had not grown in this part of Virginia since the early 20th century. What the 1,000-year frame had given Owen was not the dismissal of today. It was the ability to correctly wait today. When you understood that the decision you made now about a piece of ground would still be affecting that ground in 300 years, you stopped worrying about what Boyd Skelton said at Hensley's. You started worrying about the northwest section's microclimate and the chestnut spacing, and whether Theo understood the locust nitrogen fixing rate well enough to calibrate the understory planting in year 8. You started thinking about what your decision would look like from 300 years forward, and that perspective clarified, in ways nothing else did, which decisions were actually important and which were just urgent. Theo had stopped beside him. "Next year," Theo said. He was looking at the gap in the planting where the nursery expansion work had delayed the last round of chestnuts. "Next year," Owen said. "I'll plant that section in the fall." "I know you will," Owen said. They stood on the slope in the April cold, the two of them, and the farm was quiet around them, and the chestnuts stood bare-branched and patient. And the soil beneath them was different from what it had been 7 years ago. And in 7 more years, it would be different again. And in 50 years, it would be something that neither of them would be alive to fully see. And that was not a loss. That was the point. Owen planted the last chestnut in the gap that afternoon, in the spacing that would make sense in 80 years. He pressed the earth around the roots the way Theo had taught him to do it. Not the way Owen had been doing it in year 2, which was an engineer's method, precise and slightly too firm. But the way the land taught you to do it when you were paying attention, which was with enough pressure to settle the soil without compacting it, finding the degree of firmness by feel rather than by rule.